What was the most popular dance in 1776? Why, it was the Independence. I know you love it. Okay, let's get on with today's discussion. Taking on segregation is what we're talking about regarding civil rights today. So the concepts, let's go over those. Review segregationist policies and equal rights challenges leading up to 1954. Relate Plessy v. Ferguson, Brown v. Board of Education, and Little Rock, Arkansas to one another. And then what transpired because of the Montgomery bus boycott in 1954? And then why does a grassroots movement mesh well with nonviolent protests? Key vocab for today. We've heard of Plessy v. Ferguson before. We get a new judicial case with Brown v. Board of Education. De facto segregation, de jure segregation. Just getting a little bit more specific about the different types of segregation. Sit-ins and then the Montgomery bus boycott. The first thing I wanted to do before getting into today's lesson too far was give you a map of school segregation in 1952. This is important because the Brown v. Board of Education deals with school segregation. And it's a great visual for you to recognize where segregation is required versus the fact that some areas don't have a specific legislation to follow. And then also areas of the United States where it is actually outlawed. It's not okay to have any sort of school segregation. I think it's important to note because often we think of, a lot of people consider the South is an area where segregation occurs and occurs only. And we need to keep in mind it's just simply not the case. Getting started with segregation today, there are two things I want to make mention of. They're both in the vocab, de jure and de facto segregation. So let's start with de facto, and simply put, like in the vocab page, like on the vocab page, it says de facto segregation is segregation that is practiced by custom or tradition, something along those lines. And this is what we see more often in the North. It doesn't mean it's not in the South, but I mentioned with that school map, segregation is happening in the North, even though some of the northern states even have segregation of schools outlawed. So how can this actually be? Well, it has to do with not laws, but it has to do with people's customs and traditions, how they've been raised, etc., etc. Okay. With that said, de jure segregation, once more as highlighted in that map, we see it very much in the South with schools, and that's where a lot of the de jure segregation is. But this is something that legislatively has to be overturned because segregation is in the law. This is what so much of the civil rights movement is addressing and trying to take care of in the 50s, 60s, and into the 70s, and it's stuff that there are shortcomings in legislation that have not been corrected since the end of the Civil War. Plessy v. Ferguson, let's go back to unit number 1 for us, and Plessy v. Ferguson was when separate but equal, when segregation was allowed by the United States. This idea that you could be separate, that races could be separate but equal, came into existence. And over time, we find out that it is simply not the case. Okay, I said we find out that it's not the case. Well, there was evidence all around to notice that segregation was unequal, but nothing was done about it. Nothing significant was done about it. People recognized it. Some people recognized it. Some people fought for it. But it's not until the 1950s that it develops a federal and national movement, which is so important. So Brown v. Board of Education, is going to be a huge case that's going to overturn Plessy v. Ferguson and say that segregation is not equal and therefore segregation needs to come to an end. Of course, implementing the end of segregation and just simply ending segregation are two completely different matters, and we see that with the Little Rock Nine. It's an event in Little Rock, Arkansas, where we have African American students who are trying to attend a school that was previously all white due to segregation. Well, it's not supposed to be all white anymore, but the racism and discrimination runs deep, which is why segregation was in existence to begin with. So the Little Rock Nine are trying to get access to a school, but it doesn't appear that they're going to get access safely. And so we see President Eisenhower, this is in the 50s, we see President Eisenhower take federal action, calling in the National Guard to make sure that these students are able to enter the school safely. It's quite an event that follows up the Brown v. Board of Education decision. Now, returning back to 1954, we also had the Montgomery bus boycott. And here's a situation where we have some very popular, famous names that all originate from this event. And the first is Rosa Parks. Rosa Parks, history has not treated her correctly, I think is the best way to put it. Often she's depicted as an individual who is an older woman, elderly. We feel sympathy for her. She was tired, so she didn't want to get out of her seat. This is an inaccurate depiction of who Rosa Parks actually is. While she may have been older than many civil rights activists, for example, that we see college age, so on and so forth, she very much knew what she was doing when it comes to the Montgomery bus boycott, and it is her action that set the whole boycott off. She was on a bus, she was in a seat, she was asked to move from it, and she declined. She said she did not want to get up, and she knew the implications of not doing that. She was arrested. Again, she knew these implications. She was arrested, and then now this movement kind of takes control. People are upset by this, and a boycott of the bus system, which has a very heavy minority and African American population using it, starts a boycott. And that boycott is led by Martin Luther King Jr. And this boycott of the bus system in Montgomery lasts for over a year, and it is successful. Why? Because it hits at the economics of the bus system. I mentioned the African American population is a heavy user of this bus system. So when African Americans start using carpooling as a way to get to and from work, well, that hits at the pockets of the bus system, and eventually changes have to be made regarding segregation on the Montgomery buses.